I'm Drew Sagrillo, and I'm going to be the videographer of this interview.
I'm Michael Szymanski. I'm the lead interviewer of this interview, and we're interviewing Ron Szymanski. Hi, so what's your name?
My name's Ron Szymanski.
And where were you born, Ron?
I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin,
And how old are you right now?
77 years old.
So one of the first questions you want to go over is where you were born and hospital and stuff like that. So where were you born?
I was born in Milwaukee at St. Michael's Hospital, which was on the north side. I don't think the hospital is around anymore.
And after the growing up, obviously as a baby and stuff like that, where'd you live in the household from childhood? During childhood, where'd you live?
Okay, I initially lived for a very short time, maybe 6 months, from birth to about 6 months, on the south side on about 31st and Greenfield Avenue. And then my parents moved to the north side on 59th and North. And then when I was about 1.5 years, 2 years old, they found a home on Humboldt and Burleigh. And so I lived on Humboldt and Burleigh from then until I was 15 years old.
Do you have any memories from 15 and under? Like you said, since you lived there until you were 15, any specific memories about the neighborhood?
One thing that I'd have to say, when you go past the neighborhood now, it doesn't look much different than when it did. I'm 77, I left it when I was 15, and the neighborhood has stayed quite well intact. It's part of what they call the River West neighborhood, and probably the difference is the amount of freedom there was then. I had two sisters who were younger than I, who were twins, and they, at 2 and 3 years old, they would go to Gordon Park, which was about 4 blocks, or Pumping Station, which was about 2 blocks, on their own. And so that, today you wouldn't trust kids, or guess you'd get arrested if you had little kids doing that. The neighborhood was just great. I mentioned the 2 parks. Gordon Park had a swimming pool. So from when I was about 6 until I left the neighborhood, at 15 I used to spend the summers swimming morning, noon, and night. My cousin would come on bus and we'd spend the day together doing that. When I was young, in my very young years, through about 3rd grade, I had a friend, Robert Ropel, who was a very close friend. In fact, we shared a birthday together. And so he left when I said I was about 3rd grade. And at that point, my cousin sort of was the person I spent much more time with. I did have a brother who was 2.5 years younger than I, but it's interesting that we didn't do a lot of playing together. And we might have, I don't remember, we used to play, baseball and things of that sort. But I just remember all the arguing everybody used to do. I don't remember the games at all.
So you mentioned the neighborhood. Did you have any neighbors that you hung out with and stuff like that? The kids around the neighborhood also?
Well, I said Robert Ropel was the one who was the closest. There really weren't a lot of kids in the neighborhood, now when I think about it.
So what type of ethnicities and was the neighborhood diverse?
The diversity, it was a white neighborhood, and the diversity came from the populations, the ethnic populations. It was balanced, I'd say, between German and Polish ancestry families. Now, all the neighbors and the people who lived in the neighborhood were probably 1st or 2nd generation Americans already, but it was not the foreign-born were a few miles probably north of the area where I lived.
And what ethnicity were you?
Total Polish ancestry. My mother's mom and dad each came individually from Poland on their own. My grandmother was 16 when she came. She came alone. And then my dad's family, they too came from Poland, but individually. So all four of my grandparents were of Polish ancestry.
And then do you know where in Poland they lived and like what areas they lived in?
That I don't have a complete picture. In fact, from my dad's side, I don't know. My grandparents on my dad's side were dead by the time I was born. On my mother's side, my grandfather died when I was 3 years old. My grandmother died when I was 15, but she spoke no English. So, and then at that time, people wanted everybody to melt into the melting pot, so you didn't stress your differences like you do in today's society. The one thing I could make a guess, I would suspect that my grandmother came from the part of Poland that was occupied by the Russians. I can tell that by the choice of family names and by some of the incidents I remember my grandmother talking about. When I talked to her, I had to learn Polish in order to communicate. My parents were fluent in Polish, but never spoke Polish around the house. All my aunts and uncles were fluent in Polish, but it was my grandmother who was the person I had to speak Polish to. Not that I really now wish that I would have retained much more of it.
When did you start learning it? Like what age?
You know, I probably started as early as 4 or 5 years old. And it started with simpler vocabulary when you'd identify objects like cabbage or potato. So you knew kartofla was potato, kapusta was cabbage, things of that sort. So it's the basic food items. Voda was water, things of that sort. And then eventually what happened is I started to understand sentences and could communicate in simple sentences with her.
So what jobs did she have when she came over to America?
That's
jobs dad and mom included for you at least?
I don't know if my grandmother ever worked. She originally came to the United States and first lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She married someone there. My mother and my aunt were the product of their relationship, and then he must have died, and my grandmother then moved to Cleveland, lived there for a while with my mother and my aunt, and then she moved to Chicago, and then from Chicago to Milwaukee. And somewhere along the way, she picked up what is the grandfather I knew, Grandfather Mike. And he died when I was 3 years old. And what he worked at Falk Corporation, and they had the big blast furnaces, and his job was to clean the furnaces after they used them for a significant job. So he took in a lot of asbestos and things of that sort and died at 57.
So then what did your mom and dad do when you were a kid?
My mother and dad, basically, I'll start with my mom. My mom started when she graduated from high school. She was, now they would call her a legal secretary or a paralegal. And so what she did is she worked at a law firm for lawyers. And did that for a number of years, then took time to have 4 children. But even when she was raising kids, she was a crossing guard, so she was doing a little work in between. And then when we all 4 were in school, me, my brother, and my 2 sisters, I being the oldest, what she did then is she went back to work, and she worked for the Milwaukee Welfare Center as a secretary, and then was often used as an interpreter when immigrants would come from Poland and needed to speak with welfare workers.
And what did your father do?
My dad was a meat cutter, and some people would call him, well, he was a butcher, but at the time I was growing up, they made a big distinction between that. The person who worked as a butcher was a person who actually worked in the slaughterhouse, and chopped up animals, and first of all had to kill them and then chop them up. A meat cutter was someone who got the prepared meats and might have taken portions of something like a cow or something like that and done subdivision of it. But that's how they distinguish the two. And the reason I remember it very clearly because my dad was part of what they called the meat cutters union rather than the butchers union.
So, him being a meat cutter, did you remember any dishes that your mom might have made from like meat that he brought home or stuff like that?
The one thing I'd have to say, growing up with a father who was a butcher, first of all, he really knew how to choose meats. He was always preoccupied with meats being fat-free or reduced the amount of fat. We had a variety of things, lots of roasts of different kinds, veal roast, pork roast, beef roast. We had beef kidneys, lots of seafood, things of this sort. So my mom was a superb cook, and my dad would bring things home. And probably some of the unusual things, being a meat cutter, he was able to get duck's blood. And duck's blood is basically that made into a soup, and it's called charnina. And so my mom would prepare the soup, add the fruits like raisins and plums, and then she'd make homemade dumplings, potato dumplings, for the soup. And then she would cut up the roast duck and then add it to the soup.
Yeah. So with those meals, did like family dinners have like a good meaning in your life, like a important meaning?
To me, family meals, eating together, has always been an important thing. What's interesting about it is being a meat cutter, and we lived on the north side, and my father worked on the south west part of the city of Milwaukee. And we didn't have a car, and so he used to take the bus to work every morning and then take the bus home. So we practically never had supper with our dad. On Tuesdays was his off day, so that was the one day that we would have supper together, and then we would have supper on or dinner on Sundays together. So basically, I do value the family coming together, but I know what it's like when one of the members, because of work, is not able to do so.
So, when you were living in River West, what education, like what school did you go to during that time?
When I lived in the River West area, what I did is I started in the public schools in Fratney Elementary School, but my birthday's in March, and so I started mid-year at Fratney Street Elementary School in kindergarten, and that's the only thing I can remember is getting hot milk, and because they put the milk cartons next to the radiators, and I'd go home puking a lot because the milk did not agree with my system. So that's all I remember of Fratney Street School. And then when September came, my parents enrolled me at St. Mary of Chinstava, Our Lady of Chinstava School, and I went there from first grade through 8th grades, a Catholic school. It's now, I think, called Mesmer High Middle School. It closed as an elementary school eventually.
Would you say that your Catholic education really shaped you as a person or a learner or anything?
The education I got was absolutely superb. In so many ways, it was St. Mary Chinstava, Our Lady of Chinstava is an icon or a very sacred image in Poland. And so the grade school did emphasize Polish cultures. At Christmas time, we would learn Christmas carols in Polish. We learned a lot about the history of Poland, things of that sort. I got an excellent background in learning in English language arts as a preparation. Also, the school very much focused on empowering rather than enabling. And what I mean by that, Already in second grade, I would participate as an acolyte, and so they didn't. And at that time, it wasn't just doing some things for the mass with the priest. You actually had to learn Latin in order to say the prayers of response on behalf of the congregation. So there was a real focus on things of that sort. Good science education and things of this sort. We had limited facilities in terms of physical education, in terms of today's Phi Ed. So they were simple tasks, but I can remember 7th and 8th grade most because the nun who was the 8th grade teacher was also the principal. And for our Phi Ed, we had dance program. So we learned folk dancing and formal dances and things of this sort, which was a wonderful opportunity for socialization, to learn how to socialize as well as getting your physical skills.
So during your time at Czestochowa, did you have any favorite teachers or a class by chance that you really enjoyed from others? Like a subject?
I basically, none of the teachers stand out except that 8th grade teacher. And the reason I said she was principal, she was an excellent teacher, and the other thing is she just knew how to help kids socialize, and I thought she was good. None of the other teachers came off negatively, but I see them more as a single unit rather than as individuals. The one thing I can remember that we also learned in terms of practical skills, every year we used to have a festival, and they'd have different figures like rag dolls and that, and so all of us learned practical skills of sewing and all that because we'd prepare the toys that were used at the different booths for the festival.
So after Czestochowa, you obviously went on to high school or middle school, right?
Right. I went to St. Mary's or Our Lady of Czestochowa from 1st grade through 8th grade. Then I went to Mesmer High School. I had originally my parents were often thinking of moving from the northeast part of town to the southwest part of town. And so I was going to go to Notre Dame High School. And they said, what are you going to go all the way across town? In terms of forward planning, was thinking, they're not going to be here in a couple of years. So I finally decided to just go to Mesmer. And I was at Mesmer 1 year, and my parents moved to the southwest part of town. And so for the next 3 years, I took the bus because I did find I enjoyed Mesmer High School really a lot. It was a co-ed school, and that wasn't the main reason, but it was really interested. Kids were really interested in academics, and the teachers held high standards. At that time, Mesmer High School was an archdiocesan high school. It wasn't a magnet school as it is now.
And then you mentioned taking the bus to school. So did you enjoy taking the bus, looking around at different sites and stuff?
Okay, well, the interesting thing about that, they didn't have bus service at that time, school buses, and so you used city buses. So I lived in the city of Greenfield, so it was outside the city limits. So I had to take a bus from the city of Greenfield to Oklahoma and Forest Home, and then a bus all the way across town, and then get off on Capitol Drive and take a bus to Mesmer. So I spent about an hour and 20 minutes on the bus every day, and you started to analyze. You'd see different people. There was plenty of time for study, and I guess I learned a lot about society that way too, because in being on the bus so long, you saw very many populations get on and get off, and you started to get to know people over a number of years. And when I was in my senior year, I started to take a different route and found out there was another way. And that was because I had found a friend who lived in the city of Greenfield also, who was traveling all the way across town. So we traveled together in my senior year.
And then when you went to Mesmer, did any of your former classmates go with you, or were you the only one from Chinstahova?
There were a number of kids who went from Our Lady of Chinstahova. The reason I'm saying St. Mary's in the years I was there, they originally called it St. Mary Chinstahova. Then they changed it to Our Lady because in Poland, the icon is called Our Lady of Chinstahova. So they really were updating it and making it more accurate. So many of the kids went to Mesmer High School. I'd say, in fact, anyone who went to a Catholic high school ended up going to Mesmer.
And then at Mesmer, did you have any significant memories that pop out to you? Anything that really highlights the time that you had there?
There are some of the teachers who stood out either one way or the other. And I can remember one teacher that I had for chemistry who was just magnificent. She was a nun and very practical in her teaching of chemistry, but also you didn't realize how brilliant she was. The year I had her, she went to California because she had discovered another element for the periodic table and was going to do presentations. So she really stood out. But some of the math teachers I had very well too. They were very good too. There's a Sister Emmanuel that comes to my mind who was just a tiny little nun and probably ancient already when I had her. But she was just a superb teacher. In fact, when I went to Marquette University, after I originally was a math major, along with chemistry major, but once I got to the university, my interests changed in terms of academic areas.
So you mentioned before that when you go to Mesmer, you travel from Greenfield. So when did you move to Greenfield and then buy a house there?
Right. I had completed the first year at Mesmer High School, and then that year, my grandmother died when I was mid-year my freshman year, and then my parents found a lot in the city of Greenfield, and then decided to have a house built. And so the following September, from my sophomore, junior, and senior year, all 3 years I was living at the Greenfield residence.
And then where in Greenfield was that? Was that on a border in the middle?
It was actually, in terms of the city of Greenfield, it would probably be considered the eastern side. I lived about 4600 west, and I think the city of Greenfield went to about 35th Street, but now it goes beyond Highway 100. So.
And then what was the neighborhood like over there compared to what you had?
It was a very mixed neighborhood, and what I mean by that, I'm talking about Greenfield, but we lived in a subdivision, and ours was the last house that was in the city of Greenfield, because my next door neighbors were part of Milwaukee. It was a very cut up neighborhood, and so you'd live go right down the street, and all of a sudden you were in another city. It was very middle class neighborhoods.
So you mentioned the bordering and stuff, like your neighbor being on Milwaukee's side. Was there anything that occurred that you could see the changes happening from Milwaukee in the city and changing its climates to Greenfield?
Well, actually, I lived in Greenfield, and the lot next door, the whole area west of me, was a vacant field for a long time. So there were a number of years that it was undeveloped. And then for quite a few years, probably about 7 or 8 years, and by the time I was already in college and that's when they started to build additional homes. And the tendency was for those homes to be a little more modest in price range and style.
What type of home did you live in?
I lived in what they called during the 1950s a ranch style home. And the brick was what they call Roman brick, which is a very narrow brick. It's really interesting because I first learned it and didn't forget about it. And I've done a lot of traveling as an adult and to a lot of cities where I've seen Roman city, Italian cities where I've seen Roman brick, or when Romans moved and expanded other parts of the world, they brought their style of brick. So I thought, oh, I recognized the brick style, and something that I had looked like a very modern home, but it had some of those traces of the past in it.
And then during your time at high school, do you remember who the mayor was at the time and any like decisions that he made that you might have agreed with? Or?
At the time, the mayor was Zeidler, or I think it was his name, and he probably is one of the reasons that my parents decided to move out of Milwaukee, because they wanted to live in the neighborhood. They felt Milwaukee was getting too socialistic, and so their tendency was to move out of the city of Milwaukee. We were still in Milwaukee County, but Greenfield is a separate city.
So, did you agree with your parents' decision on the socialist part?
Well, at that time, I wasn't concerned about that. I was young enough for it not to make a difference. If I would be 40 or 50, I might have a different point of view.
Yeah.
And actually, when I started to work for Milwaukee Public Schools, I started to sense some of the effects of it, but actually not so much until the 1970s, when it started to have repercussions in different ways.
So after Mesmer High School, you said you wanted to Marquette U?
That's right. I went to Marquette University, and as I said earlier, I started in math and science, and during my freshman year, my math teacher was young and always had the window open and would smoke a cigarette during the class and drink Coke, and I got totally uninterested in mathematics as a result of it, because I became more observant of his behavior, his aberrant behavior. And so that took me out of math after the semester. And then I also was in chemistry, and the chemistry professor I had was outstanding. But the thing is, when I went to Marquette, the medical school was on Marquette campus. It was Marquette Medical School. And most of the kids who were taking chemistry were pre-med students. I was not intending to be a pre-med student. And I had the major professor had one quiz section and one lab session out of about 60 sessions. And I got him for both. And so at the end of the year, I decided chemistry was no longer an interest of mine. I found the English classes stimulating, and so that's why I gravitated toward that. And then I also really enjoyed history. I had European history the first year, and I had a professor, Szymanski, who was from the Ukraine. And instead of giving short answers, when we would have a test, there was what they call blue books. You'd get essay questions, and then you'd fill the blue book responding. And he had come from Ukraine and loved history intellectually. And he's the person who said to me, you'd make an excellent historian, because he said, you really treat history differently. I was more considered, I always looked at history more from a cultural point of view. I was aware of the military aspects, but I always was concerned about how did the people live. And that's what my answers often focused on. And in fact, when I student taught in history, my supervising teacher was just amazed at the way I focused the history classes. But it was my interest. So they still got all the dates and wars and things of that sort, but they also came to understand what the people's lives were like during that time.
So then I'm assuming you switched your major to history then?
Right. So from the sophomore year on, I had majors in English and history with minors in philosophy and education. At the time I went to Marquette, you didn't major in education, you minored, so you focused on your content areas that you were going to teach in.
And then on Marquette's campus, do you remember which dorms you lived in?
I was a student who lived at home, so I would commune to school every day by bus. Just notice bus is a big word in my life.
So, at your time at Marquette, was there any experiences that you really remember, like changed your life, or besides education and stuff like that?
I loved my years at Marquette, and they really influenced my teaching style, my philosophic point of view, my understanding why you took philosophy, things of that sort. But one of the other things that I learned in some of the English classes I was in, there was a professor, Dr. Pick, and he used to give little quizzes to make sure that everybody was up on the reading for the day. This was a literature class, British literature. And so I became friends with different group of kids, and what we would do is we would meet at each other's house, alternate the house visits, and what we would do is prepare together. We'd do our readings, and then we'd quiz each other, so that when we got to class, when the quiz came out, we had things mastered. So many years later, when as a teacher, we studied cooperative learning and how you get kids to function in groups, and I really had experienced that during my years at Marquette. So from my sophomore through my senior year, a group of 8 of us would always often take the same courses and then study together. So it became a way of learning. And in that way, you learned other people's perspectives. When we'd approach literature, we'd see it from different points of view. And so it was, we became a threat in the English classes that other students would see us come in and think, oh no, there are the A's and B pluses.
So you mentioned your time at Marquette University. After that, did you receive any more education at different universities?
After completing Marquette University, I went into teaching, and then I pursued simultaneously a master's degree in English and English education from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And so what I would do is on occasion take a course at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, but each summer I would spend for the next 4 summers in Madison and would pursue. The English was traditional masters in English, and the English education aspect of it was how do you apply different aspects of language, literature, and language, literature, and composition to the field. And so it was very enriching type of thing because I was learning not only about literature, language, and composition in the abstract, I was also learning about techniques of applying it to the teaching profession. And then we also did things, exploring media and things of that sort. When it was in the 60s, but there was already the movement toward multimedia, so I was getting a head start on some of those things.
How would you describe the climates of the 2 schools, Milwaukee and Madison?
The difference between Milwaukee, I'm going to take Marquette and Madison, is you definitely knew you were going from a religious-oriented college setting to a secular setting. I happen to have been going through Madison during the 60s, and there was a great emphasis on both atheism. You found signs, big billboards everywhere that God is dead. And then secondly, being a secular university, some of the philosophic issues about the importance of life, if the person doesn't have a high IQ, it's time to put an end to their being able to raise children and have children. Those kinds of ideas were radical by my perspective, but they just broadened my view of the world. I did have some professors who were just magnificent, who added to the good teachers that I had in English at Marquette. I also, in the English ed aspect of my program, got to know two of the professors very well, and did work in what they call the English Journal, which was a national publication for teachers of English. So I expanded my professional life in working with professors like that.
So you talked about going there in the 60s. Did you experience the riots in the 60s?
Actually, if I think about the riots, I was on campus during the summer in '67 when the riots were really bad. And I had come home one weekend to just spend some time with the family. And it happened to be the big weekend with the big marches and the burnings down. And then there was a curfew. You could not leave Milwaukee County. Well, I needed to go back to Madison to defend my master's degree work. And so I remember that aspect, trying to find a way to get out of the city. Actually, it was out of the county. And then I remembered the different buildings being burnt down and aspects of that sort, the rioting. And then the follow-up on it would be all the emphasis on redlining neighborhoods and things of that sort.
So how did you find a way out of the county during that time?
They ended up providing some freeway exits to people who needed to go outside the state. And I happened to take I'm trying to think, I probably had a car use of a car at that time. And so I drove to Madison. Usually I would take the Badger bus service to Madison.
So then during that time, you also mentioned you were teaching while doing the majors at the same time.
Right. I started to teach right after graduating from Marquette, and I taught at Messmer High School. Excuse me, not Messmer High School, Custer High School. And it was a high school grades, they called it a senior high. It was grades 10 through 12, and we had 3,600 students. I was member in the English department, and there were 56 English teachers in the department. And I started the first year with teaching some sophomore English classes, and then I taught 2 creative writing classes with 56 English teachers. Nobody wanted to teach creative writing, so it was dumped on me. And it turned out to be a great thing to have dumped on me, because number of kids, and at that time it was an elective course. So you took your regular sophomore, junior, and senior, and creative writing was an extra course you took. And I built such an interest in creative writing that we started to offer advanced composition. So I taught creative writing, advanced comp, and then I ended up teaching journalism with no journalism experience. But I was at what Custer was called a comprehensive high school. So what we did there is they actually had a department where you had hands-on experiences. So you would have an automotive department, you would have a print shop and that. And so the printing of the school newspaper was not sent out. The printing was done all within the school. And so I had one class in print shop with no experience in that type of work. So we learned how to do layouts and justifying type, lots of jargon to you. But it was all jargon to me till I learned how to use it. So we ended up printing a newspaper every 2 weeks. And I happened to be an idealist, so sometimes the topics the principal did not particularly like how it was treated, you know. He thought I was going to follow the line. And if he'd throw out, one time he wanted us to talk about how is Custer High School comprehensive high school. And I took the elements of a comprehensive high school and had the kids analyze to what degree Custer High School fit the model and in what ways it failed it. And so it was things like that. But I wasn't controversial. I just wanted to give an honest appraisal of things. So that was another thing I did, is taught one journalism class that way.
And then, what was the environment like at the Custer High School?
It's surprising. The school was fantastically well run with a large number of kids, and we didn't have enough space, so they would have to set up, some classrooms were in corridors. If there would be a large open area, they would set up a couple temporary walls, and so it was really a packed school. And but things went quite well for that type of school, and the class sizes were quite generous, 28, 32 per class.
And then you mentioned the different classes that you taught, and then were you close with any other teachers at the high school by chance?
I basically was. I was close to some of the English teachers, and but I was particularly close to the department chair. She really, again, as an individual, often look at things differently. And so I was assigned a class for what they call SAP. It was Superior Ability Students in American Lit. And so when we would do the unit on the American writers who were studying in France, I would have her, since she was an English teacher but also taught French, I had her come in and teach the kids simple lessons in French so they'd learn some French vocabulary that impacted the English language. So we did a lot of team teaching that way. And then other teachers would recognize that, and more would ask to team teach. And it was often team teaching of two people of the same content area rather than one social studies and one English teacher.
And then at your time there, did you experience any troubles with students teaching, or not them teaching, but while you were teaching, did you have any troubles with students? I basically didn't have problems with kids who were in my better classes, but I had a class of sophomore English kids, and their attitudes were not as bad as attitudes eventually got in the school district, but they were already moving in that direction, and so there would sometimes be, I would need to challenge some of the kids who were not particularly interested in learning. Mm-hmm. So then after Custer High School, what was next? Did you teach in another high school then?
After I had been at Custer for 5 years, and originally after my first year, I was asked to come to central office to become an English supervisor, but that was only 1 year of teaching English, and I was not ready to leave. So after 5 years, I was asked again, and what I did is the person, the English department chair, who I had mentioned, was going to leave to go to another school. So I asked the principal if I could be English department chair, and he said no. And so I decided at that point I went to central office, and it provided me an opportunity for change and growth. And so I became an English supervisor and supervised English teachers from grades 7 through 12 in junior and high schools, junior highs and high schools.
What did central office what was its purpose? Is it an overarching?
I was in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, and as a supervisor of English, what I was to do is to visit English classes, and we had a curriculum, and I don't mean it was a straitjacket type of curriculum, but there were basic areas of that were to be taught: language, composition, literature. And so my basic job would be to sit in the back of classrooms, observe the teacher, make notes on what was going on, and then having a follow-up conference with the teacher, have her or him analyze what they thought were the strengths of the class and what were the weaknesses, and then I try to make suggestions for improvement. So it wasn't an evaluation type of out to get you type. It was trying to help teachers become stronger and stronger. And some of the most challenging and exciting things were teachers who were outstanding to begin with, who you needed to provide them some avenues for continued growth. So it was absolutely delightful.
So where was the office located for the?
Okay, so central office at that time was on 52nd Street and Vliet. And so I was there just for that year. I had planned, they hired me to be an English supervisor. I missed the classroom so much that after a year I asked to go back to the classroom. So I was assigned to another high school, Hamilton High School, and I was there for a year. And during that time, since they did not know I was going to be assigned, I had 5 freshman classes, which was utterly boring because at Custer I had every hour I had taught a different subject. So I had that first semester and coped with it. And then second semester I was going to pilot a new course called Communications and Media, which was film and different communications areas. And so I was going to have one class of it, but we were an experiment and only the seniors were going to be open since I was doing it on behalf of the school district. It turned out that almost every senior wanted it. So I had 5 classes of 34 students. And so I was experimenting with a new course and exposing all those kids to it. But it was delightful. So in fact, it would have been June 21st, 1970, the Milwaukee Journal did a Sunday edition they used to call a magazine section called Insight, and they did 4 or 5 pages on my teaching at the Hamilton High School and some of the experimentation with the English curriculum.
So did they interview you in the article at all, or was it just about your course and stuff?
They actually did an interview. They came to visit the class, and it was at the time, many people now don't know Marshall McLuhan, but he was very popular in communications and analyzing media. And then I had the kids watch different films, and they learned to analyze body language and things of that sort. So it wasn't only verbal, it was expanding their understanding of communication. And Hamilton High School was on the southwest part of Milwaukee, and many of the kids were Serbian or of Polish or Russian heritage. So I had foreign films like Ivan the Terrible, a Russian film, very highly stylized and all that. So we did lots of foreign films. It expanded the kids' understanding. And now I told you I had 5 classes. I would see the film 5 times over. And it was interesting after watching it 5 times, I saw things 5th time around that I didn't see the 4th time. So it was an interesting opportunity.
So then after Hamilton, teaching there.
So I ended up teaching at Hamilton for a year, and then many of the teachers who were colleagues of mine at Hamilton said, "You were so good as a supervisor," and an opening occurred. One of the women supervisors was going to retire, and they asked me to come back. And so I decided at that point that I started to realize, and many of the teachers said, you became a teacher to us rather than to students. And so I went back and spent the rest of my career as an English supervisor and ultimately the curriculum specialist for English in Milwaukee.
So then, as you're in that job, did anything stick out to you? Any aspects of the job or things that you did that you really enjoyed? Things that you put in place in the Milwaukee public system that you
the one thing is, when I came to Milwaukee, the reason the curriculum specialist wanted me to go to central office so soon is I came through Marquette, and they started to approach teaching language differently. There was what they call the traditional way of teaching language, parts of speech and that. And I started to learn what are called structural and transformational ways. And this is jargon to you, but these are tools that help kids learn how to generate sentences, how to compose. And so I had a lot of training in that. So that was one of the reasons, though I didn't take the position at central office, they would often use me on committees to change the language curriculum. And then when I returned to central office, I mentioned that I piloted the media classes, and then the Milwaukee Public Schools went over, instead of English 1, English 2, English 3, English 4, we went over to an elective system. And I worked with teachers piloting a lot of courses, creating courses in English.
So then, reflecting back on that, like, how do you feel about how like Milwaukee Public Schools is now, based on what you worked with them before?
The one thing is we introduced the elective program to give kids choice, but no matter what courses they took, they had a certain number of compositions and language activities. And ultimately, kids were less and less responsible. You know, they didn't care whether they did things well. And so later in my career, what I did is we established what was called a writing proficiency. And that meant that in order to graduate from a high school in Milwaukee Public Schools, you had to meet a writing proficiency. And they had to do 2 compositions. And if you didn't and you were a senior, what you could get is a certificate of attendance, but you wouldn't get a diploma. Now, the reason that came into being, at first kids thought, they're going to give us all a diploma. After 1 year of kids realizing it, in order to get a diploma, they would have to come back as graduates and take English courses or find somebody to tutor them so they could meet the proficiency. So within a year, that changed. Now, the reason I'm mentioning all that, the kids started to get responsible. They were knowing that they were going to be held accountable, or they're going to sit in school for 4 years and not leave with a diploma. As a result of it, the teachers who were in English all worked together. We developed criteria for looking at kids' writing, and it was great because we had tools for holding kids accountable. We had teachers who didn't feel frustrated because the kids were participating and actively involved. And so at the time I left, the proficiency in English was still there. And then kids had to keep writing portfolios, writing portfolios, things of that sort. So you can tell we created tools to make kids accountable, and that helped the kids as well as the teachers. It also brought much more collegiality among English teachers from school to school. And eventually, I incorporated from elementary school on, kids had to learn to have their writing assessed periodically at the elementary level, the middle school, and the high school level. So we brought greater strength all the way through.
So then, after the central office job, what was next for you in terms of jobs and stuff?
After working for Milwaukee Public Schools for 33 years, I decided to retire. And I had colon cancer the year before, so that helped me. And also in my last 4 or 5 years in Milwaukee, what I was doing in Milwaukee Public Schools was catching on, and I was hired. I still work for Milwaukee Public Schools, but I would work at the State Department and develop writing tools to be used with public school kids in all schools. And so that brought me in contact with lots of educators, English educators, outside of Milwaukee. And so I was offered many contracts as not a supervisor, but a specialists to come in and work with school districts. So I decided to leave Milwaukee, retired, and then I worked the next 6 years as a consultant in English. And I worked across the content areas. So that was the way I earned a salary after retiring for the next 6 years. Didn't have a business card because I became so well known in the state of Wisconsin.
So then, since you retired, what was like your meantime leisure activities that you do, such as like traveling?
Okay, traveling is a good example. Already, while I was still a teacher in Milwaukee, or an employee of Milwaukee Public Schools, I started to travel abroad. And until I was 75 years old, I have been on 35 trips abroad, and really have come to know Europe, the Near East, Far East. And basically, I'd have different strands for why I would travel to different countries. And it's given me a wonderful outlook. By when I say different strands, I mentioned I've always been interested in culture. So I'll look at the arts, music, the way people live, their style of architecture, and just various philosophic ways people, or different ways they're governed. And it gives me a wonderful perspective. And it gives me some notion of what's happening in the United States and how it may be following patterns that other countries have used around the world.
So then, through your traveling and stuff, did you use the ideas you learned in the architecture you've learned around different continents around the world and stuff like that? Did you use that later on when you would give tours and stuff like that in the Basilica?
Okay, that's right. Now I am a docent, sort of a pro bono type of activity that I do. And I give tours at St. Josephat. And they're historical tours, but they're more than that. St. Josephat was founded by Polish immigrants to Milwaukee. And so I look at the Polish culture, look at the history of Poland, why the people came here to the United States, and then how they were involved in building the church. And then what I do is I explore, the church is done in a Renaissance architecture because St. Josephat, the saint after whom the church is named after, happened to have been, he died in Poland, he was martyred in Poland, and he buried in Poland. Then in the 19th century, Pope Pius VI had his body exhumed, found that it was incorrupt, and his body was taken to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So I explore with the groups I bring through how St. Josephat represents Renaissance architecture, and how it's a model, a simple model of St. Peter's Basilica. And then in addition to that, I explore all the visual images. It's a church that is just so laden with visual imagery. And so what I do is help people look at the images and start to see that it's not a hodgepodge, but that the whole church has been thoughtfully put together around a theme, a central theme, and that being God's dwelling place.
So do you think the placement of the church was appropriate for the Polish people who lived there, and do you think it influenced the communities around them also?
Well, they the question is good. The thing is, they are responsible for St. Josephat being. So what I think is so marvelous about it is it showed what they stood for, their ability to craft, because they built the church from scratch. And the one thing that when I bring groups through, they're amazed at the theological, the religious insights that the parishioners had. But knowing Polish populations and having been to Poland twice and growing up in a Polish environment, I know that they brought a great insight into the understanding of the Catholic religion, and it's very well carried through in the themes. The stained glass windows, the oil paintings, various things, all come together.
So how do you think the communities changed around the church as times went on?
Well, what has happened over time is many of the Polish immigrants, their succeeding generations, have moved further west and further south. So the area has changed. There are many more Hispanics who live in the neighborhood now. And I'd also say there's been a migration of African Americans from the north side via the 6th Street Viaduct to the area. And many of them aren't Catholic, so the neighborhood has a lot of African American residents who do not attend the church. The other thing is, as a result, there's a diminished population. Much of that is made up by parishioners coming from around the city. So the surrounding suburbs provide, many of the parishioners from the surrounding suburbs come to St. Josaphat and augment. So it's an unusual conglomeration of parishioners.
And then, like on the topic of like the Polish people, like what's your opinion on like Saint Stanislaus and like its role in the early Catholic community in Milwaukee and stuff?
Well, St. Stanislaus was the first Catholic parish on the south side, named after the first bishop of Krakow, Poland, and actually the first Polish martyr. And so that served, he serves as a figure both for the Polish community broadly on the south side. And then there's evidence of his being honored at St. Josaphat itself, because some of the stained glass windows deal with his role as a bishop and how he was ultimately martyred by the king of Poland at the time. It was a squabble over who owned the land.
So would you say that, have you like gone to St. Stanislaus to have church? I mean, go to church at St. Stanislaus before?
I had gone when I was a youth. It wasn't our regular parish, but when I would go to visit various aunts and uncles, we would always spend Christmas Eve there, and then sometimes at Easter time. And then as an adult, I would often go there. And then I said, now when I turned 70, I decided to make it my parish in my senior years.
So one more thing was when you went to Christmas Eve with your family, was it like a high mass, a Latin high mass? Was it all in Latin, right?
Well, it was in Latin. The mass itself was in Latin, and all the carols were in Polish, because Poland has a really rich history of Christmas carols, absolutely beautiful carols. And so what would happen at Christmas time, the church would be filled to capacity, and you'd have to arrive 2 or 3 hours ahead of time to make sure to get a seat. And they'd have a half hour to 45 minutes before with English carols. Then the Mass would be in Latin, augmented with carols in Polish. But that's right, it was pre-Vatican II.
Well, this concludes the interview, and I want to say thank you for letting us interview you and sharing your history in Milwaukee and yourself also. So
Thank you for the opportunity.
thank you.